Today's lesson is Dialogue Focus, a Home Handyman. Hi, everybody. My name is Roger.
And I'm Helen.
And today we've got a conversation going on between Josh and Evie, and they're doing all sorts of things at the home. And if you don't want to go out and buy new things, it'd be better if you are some kind of handyman or somebody who's very skilled in fixing things or building things and stuff like that. So we've got a home handyman in today's lesson. I guess you could use that to describe both a girl and a boy.
Yes, and the word handy is a word that refers to somebody who is able to do things with their hands, who is good at doing things with their hands. So if you say, she's really handy with a saw and hammer, then what you're really saying is she is really good at making or doing things with wood. And it's the case that I think in the past, people were more handy because people spent less time on the computer because there was no computer and they didn't spend a lot of time on their phones. So I think people were more hands-on with fixing things and figuring out how things work, taking things apart and putting them back together. And it may not be the case anymore today.
So let's find out what this is all about in part 1 of our Dialogue Focus unit for the month of May. Part 1, plugging in an old fan. Let's listen.
A home handyman. Plugging in an old fan. Summer is approaching, so Josh and Evie decide to take their fan out of storage. Wow, it's dusty in here. We should probably do a spring clean at some point. Ah, there it is.
Do you need a hand pulling it out?
No, I think I've got it. Can you step back? Phew, this thing is heavier than I remembered. It's bigger, too.
Let me just dust it off a little. Shall we see if it still goes?
Yeah, we may as well. The fan rattles a little and then begins to make a high-pitched whining sound. Eesh, this thing sounds awful.
Yeah, it's definitely not running as smoothly as it should be. I wonder what the problem is.
I might have to pull it apart and take a look.
大家好，第一部分我们看到动词 grunt 表示咕哝或是发出哼声，像是 The old man grunted as he reached for his glasses. 那位老先生在伸手去拿眼镜的时候咕哝了一下，或是 My sister grunted because my mom didn't want to buy her a toy. 我的妹妹发出哼的一声，因为我妈妈不想买玩具给她。另外补充这个字的同义词 mutter, M-U-T-T-E-R, mutter. 这个字是动词，指低声嘀咕或是咕哝。例如 Jake muttered to himself as he tried to repair his broken phone. Jake 一边试图修自己坏掉的手机，一边自己碎碎念。或是 During the sales meeting, Kelly muttered that she hadn't eaten all day. 在销售会议时 Kelly 咕哝着说自己整天都还没吃东西。再来我们看到单字 rattle. 这个字是动词，意思是嘎嘎作响或是发出碰撞声。像是 The explosion rattled the windows in the building. 爆炸威力让那栋大楼的窗户震地发出碰撞声。也可以说 The loose engine part rattled every time the car accelerated. 每次当车子加速时，松掉的引擎零件都会嘎嘎作响。另外动词 rattle 也有使紧张或是使恐惧的意思。例如 Jordan felt rattled after the recent meeting he had about his poor work ethic. Jordan 最近因为工作态度不佳被约谈，他感到很紧张。或者 The plane's hard landing rattled Janine's nerves. 飞机重落地时让 Janine 很紧张。再补充一个含有 rattle 在内的片语 rattle off, O-F-F, rattle off. 意思是轻易的或是很快的说出或是写出。我们可以说 Cole rattled off a poem within 5 minutes. Cole 在5分钟内快速的写出一首诗。接着我们看到单字 yank. 这个字是动词，指猛拉。 举例来说 Jill started to cry when her brother yanked the toy out of her hand. Jill 的哥哥从他手中使劲一拉抢走玩具，他就开始哭了。或是 The priest yanked on the rope to ring the church bell. 牧师使劲拉绳索，敲响教堂钟。
So the title of today's dialogue focus is a home handyman. Before we talked a bit about what the word handy means. Now, handyman is a person who has the job of repairing things and doing practical things around the house, around other people's houses. So sometimes when you live in a building, you have a handyman who is present most of the time in case you need a shelf installed or you need plumbing work done, a leaky faucet fixed. You can call the handyman and that person will fix an appointment with you to come up and resolve that problem. But sometimes you don't have a handyman. Maybe you live at home in a house, so you're not in an apartment building, and it's good to know how to do these things yourself. So in that case, if you can do those things, you may be a home handyman. Now in part 1, plugging in an old fan, we have Josh and Evie talking to each other because summer is approaching and Josh and Evie decide to take their fan out of storage. Now, storage is a place where you keep things that you don't use all the time, but you don't want to throw away or give away. And storage could refer to just a small space, like a little closet where you put your camping gear or your fan, for instance. Or it could even be a very big space. You might want to rent storage space. If you have a lot of stuff that you can't fit at home, then you can rent storage space in a warehouse and you just pay rent every month.
Yeah, I know some friends here in Taiwan who have rented storage space in the United States. A friend of mine from Pittsburgh has rented storage space in a small town outside of Pittsburgh because he's got all of his stuff there while he and his wife are living in Czechia, and they've lived in Czechia in Germany for many years, but he still holds on to some of his old stuff, and of course he puts it in storage. He has to pay like $50 a month or something like that. And so in this particular case, though, summer is coming, summer is approaching, so my goodness, it's going to start being hot pretty soon. You got to make sure the fans are working. You probably put the fans in storage back in fall, maybe in October or so. So in this particular case, they've decided to take their fan out of storage.
So Josh is inside the storage room, and from inside the storage room, he says, "Wow, it's dusty in here." So the storage room is not a room that people go into all the time, so they certainly don't spend a lot of time cleaning it. And as a result, it's become very dusty. So something that is dusty is covered in dust or full of dust. And dust is the little particles in the air that make a place very dusty and difficult to breathe in.
Yep, dust is always flying around in the air around us. We can't see it, but it is there. It's full of microscopic particles, and eventually the dust settles on surfaces. And, of course, if you leave a room by itself for a long period of time without doing any dusting, then dust will be all over everything. And he goes into the storage room and he goes, "Oh my goodness, it's so dusty in here. We should probably do a spring clean at some point, or at some time we should do some spring cleaning." And then he finds the fan. Ah, there it is. So yes, indeed, you need to do some spring cleaning to make things as good as new.
Yes, and Evie says, "Do you need a hand pulling it out?" Because she hears that Josh seems to be having some trouble. And Josh replies, "No, I think I've got it." He grunts loudly. So this is a sound that he makes as he is trying to pull out the fan.
Right, grunting. Yeah, he's trying to move something heavy there. And in this particular case, I guess it's a very heavy fan. Fans are usually made out of plastic. At least the ones in my house are plastic for the most part. So they're not that heavy, but some of the older fans are pretty heavy indeed. So he's struggling to move the fan here. And then he asks Evie, "Can you step back? Because I'm coming out with this fan and you're kind of in the way. Can you step back a little bit, please?" Phew! This thing is heavier than I remembered. So indeed, he thought it was pretty light, but now he's going back into the storage room, and the fan seems heavier than it used to be.
Yes, and he sets the fan down on the ground. It's bigger, too, so he hasn't seen the fan in a long time, probably since last summer. And he remembers it as being smaller and lighter, so he's a bit surprised at how big and heavy it actually is.
Evie says, "Let me just dust it off a little." And she grabs a damp cloth and wipes it down. So if you want to remove the dust that has accumulated on something, you will dust it off, and you should use a damp cloth. If something's damp, it's just a little bit wet. It's not totally wet, it's just a little wet. So of course he's going to take the damp cloth and just wipe it across the fan, and then the fan should be okay and look very clean.
Yes, and when you wipe something down, you're basically cleaning it. You're giving it a superficial clean, not an in-depth cleaning, but just to get rid of whatever dirt is on the surface. And then Evie says, shall we see if it still works? So far, they've only taken it out. They're not even sure if it still works because they haven't used it in a long time. And Josh replies, yeah, we may as well. So he grabs the cord and plugs it into the outlet. Since it's an electric fan, you need to plug it in to give it electricity. So what you do is you take the cord. The cord is the electrical wire that connects a machine, in this case a fan, to an electricity supply. And he plugs the cord into the outlet. The outlet is the electrical power supply that usually comes from your wall. For instance, a lot of families with babies, with young children, they like to cover the outlet with some kind of plastic covering so that children won't stick their finger in the outlet or stick a fork in the outlet and get electrocuted.
And the fan rattles a little and then begins to make a high-pitched whining sound. Ooh, that does not sound good. So the fan rattles a little bit. If something rattles, it moves back and forth and makes some sound, probably because something is loose, and usually that's kind of a bad sign. Not necessarily, but usually if you hear a rattle sign, it means something's loose and needs to be fixed.
Yes, or you may hear things rattling during an earthquake. For instance, during the last big earthquake, my windows started rattling. So they were making this knocking sound as the earth shook because the windows were sort of going back and forth. And going back and forth, they were making this rattling sound. Now, the fan first rattled a little bit, and then the sound changed into a high-pitched whining sound. Something that is high-pitched is very high. So you might think of a cat as meowing in a high-pitched voice or a bird singing in a high-pitched voice, but you wouldn't attribute a high-pitched voice to a gorilla or a lion. Now, whining is a sound that we usually associate with young children when they don't want to do something. They'll say something like, Mom, I don't want to do this, or I don't want to go to bed so early. And that's whining. And you can just imagine what a fan might sound like when it's whining with a high-pitched sound.
Yeah, it's not a low-pitched sound. It's a high-pitched sound, and it's a whining sound. And that does not sound good. So Josh says, yeesh, this thing sounds awful, and he yanks out the cord. If you yank something, you pull it quickly. Evie says, yeah, it's definitely not running as smoothly as it should be. I wonder what the problem is. And Josh says, well, I might have to pull it apart or take it apart and then take a look. So maybe Josh is quite the handyman here, and he's going to try to repair the fan. Okay, that brings us to the end of part 1. Let's move on now to the second part and see if they have some success fixing the fan.
Getting his hands dirty. Josh gets his toolbox and some rags and sets up a chair beside the fan.
All right, let's get to work. Can you help me take the fan guard off? Just remove that clip there.
Done. Here, let me take the fan guard. I'll give it a more thorough cleaning while you're working on the fan.
Hang on, you can take the blades with you too. I just need to unscrew them. Yuck, this thing is filthy. Just look at it.
Ew, is that hair?
Yep, and dust caked with oil. There's probably a bunch of dust in the casing, too. I'll give it a quick blast of compressed air.
Wow, no wonder the motor was struggling. Here, let's test it out. Look at that! You did it!
最后第二部分，我们看到形容词 filthy， 意思是肮脏的或是污秽的，像是 Your shoes are too filthy. Where have you been today? 你的鞋子也太脏了吧？你今天去哪里了？也可以说 Joe washes his filthy clothes 3 times a week. Joe 一个礼拜洗他的脏衣服3次。另外，把这个字字尾的 y 去掉，就变成了名词 filth， 指污物或是污秽。我们可以说 The sewer is full of filth. 下水道中充满了污物。或是 Though he was covered in filth, Charlie emerged from the dumpster triumphantly, holding his previously lost backpack. 尽管满身污秽地从大垃圾桶中爬出， Charlie 成功地找回他遗失的背包。
So in part 2, Josh is about to fix the fan, and this part is called getting his hands dirty. So we're talking about Josh. And when you get your hands dirty, there are 2 things involved. First is you do get your hands dirty because when you're fixing something that might be full of dirt or oil, then your hands will get dirty. But the phrase to get your hands dirty has another meaning, which is to do physical work. So you might talk about somebody who's lazy or who doesn't like to contribute to things as someone who doesn't like to get their hands dirty very much. You know, they're kind of lazy. They don't want to take responsibility. They just want to sit back while other people are working. That's someone who doesn't like to get his or her hands dirty.
But I guess Josh is willing to get his hands dirty, and he gets his toolbox, and he gets some rags, some old pieces of cloth that are no longer useful, and he sets up a chair beside the fan. So he's going to sit down in that chair and try to fix that fan. Of course, if you want to pull apart a fan or take it apart, you need some tools, a screwdriver maybe, and some wrenches or whatever. And he's got some rags to clean things up with, and he's going to work when he sits in a chair. And then he says, all right, let's get to work. Let's start working. Can you help me take the fan guard off? Just remove that clip there. The fan guard, of course, is the thing that looks like a net that surrounds the blades of the fan. And the fan guard is there, of course, so that we don't run into the fan and get hurt because the blades are moving.
Yes, and Evie does so. She removes the fan guard and she says, done. Here, let me take the fan guard. I'll give it a more thorough cleaning while you're working on the fan. So even the fan guard is quite dirty because the fan has been in the storage room for so long. So while Josh looks more closely at the fan, at the machine itself, Evie is going to give the fan guard a more thorough cleaning. Now before, they just wiped it off, right? So they gave it a superficial cleaning. Now she's going to give it a thorough cleaning. A thorough cleaning means a cleaning that will be more careful, that will include everything, maybe every metal wire on the guard, on the frame. So she's going to do that.
Indeed. So she's going to give it a complete cleaning, maybe wash it in the bathtub or something like that, and use a hose and spray it really thoroughly to make sure it's nice and clean. And she'll do that at the same time that he is working on the fan. Now, Josh says, hang on. Can you wait a minute? You can take the blades with you too. And the blades, of course, are the part inside the fan that spin, and you can remove that pretty easily. And he thinks, well, while you're working on the fan guard, you might as well clean the blades as well. Some fans have 3 blades, some have 4. I just need to unscrew them. And that's how you remove the blades from the fan. You unscrew them. There's some kind of thing on top of it that holds it down, and you just unscrew that, and then the blades can come off as one unit usually.
Yes, and he unscrews the blades and hands them to Evie. Then he looks at the rotor and bearing. So now the fan is without a fan guard, without the blades, so it's really just the rotor and the bearing and the other parts to it left. The rotor is the part of the fan that revolves. You can also talk about the rotor of a helicopter because a helicopter also has blades that revolve, which makes the helicopter go up in the air, and there is a rotor for that as well.
Right, and of course there's a bearing there as well, which is something that the rotor and the blades attach to, the thing that spins around. And he says, yuck, this thing is filthy. Just look at it. If something's filthy, it's really, really dirty. And then Evie says, ew, is that hair? Of course, she's looking at where Josh is pointing. She's peering there. And Josh says, yep. And dust caked with oil. If something's caked with something, it has a lot of that thing in different layers, so there's a lot of oil there and dust. And then he cleans the rotor with a rag and then oils the bearing so that it can spin nicely. And he goes on to say, there's probably a bunch of dust in the casing too, which is the part that covers all the other parts of the fan. And he says, I'll give it a quick blast of compressed air. So he must have a can, I guess, or a container of compressed air, and the air will come out really quickly so that he can clean it up.
Yes, so he uses compressed air to get rid of the dust from the casing, and dust flies out as soon as he sprays it with compressed air. And Evie says, wow, no wonder the motor was struggling. So the motor before was making all of those weird noises. It was making those rattling and high-pitched whining sounds, and it was all likely because the fan was really dirty. It was caked in oil and it had dust and hair inside, so it wasn't functioning properly because it had all of these things inside that weren't supposed to be there.
Yep, no wonder the motor was making that high-pitched whining sound, and they're going to test it out now. She plugs it in. The rotor begins spinning smoothly and silently. Look at that. You did it. You are quite the handyman. Okay, that brings us to the end of our explanation for today. Let's listen now to our Chinese teacher.
各位同学大家好，我是 Hanny。 我们来看今天的文法重点。首先看到课文第二部分的对话标题，他说 Getting his hands dirty， 那这是指对话里面的 Josh 他自己动手维修。当我们说 get somebody's hands dirty， 字面意思是弄脏某人的手，可以用来表达说参与动手做什么什么事，尤其是那种困难令人不快的事情。像我们可以说 Ron's boss wants him out，But she doesn't want to get her hands dirty by firing him. Ron 的老板想要他走人，但是又不想动手解雇他，就是希望他自己走人的那种感觉。好，那我们顺便补充几个跟手有关的用语哦。第一个补充的是 Somebody's hands are tied， 字面意思是某人的手被绑住了，那它是以双手被绑住的意象来描述身不由己，引申表达说某人束手无策，无能为力，像是I wish I could help you, but my hands are tied. 但愿我能帮忙，可是我无能为力。好，那么第二个补充的是 hand to mouth， 字面意思是手到嘴。那它是用来比喻说只有少量的钱或者是食物只够供给你眼前所需，那也就是我们中文说的勉强糊口的意思，常常会用 live hand to mouth 来表达。我们造个例句 He's been living hand to mouth since he lost his job. 自从他失业以来，一直都只能勉强糊口。那第三个补充的是 wash one's hands of 加上名词，这个字面意思好像跟洗手有关，其实它是用来表达洗手不干了，不再管什么什么了，要跟什么断绝关系，不再有任何瓜葛的意思。那它的受词可以是人或是事物，例如 His parents washed their hands of him many years ago。他的父母很多年前就不管他了，可能就已经不再跟他有任何瓜葛了。好，那么第四个要补充的是 bite the hand that feeds you， 字面意思是咬喂养你的那只手，人家喂你，你还咬他，那这应该很好理解吧，就是伤害帮助过你的人，也就是忘恩负义的意思了。如果我们说 don't bite the hand that feeds you， 就是叫对方不要忘恩负义，不要不知感恩了。好，那么第五个补充的是 tip one's hand。Tip, T-I-P, 在这边它是当动词，有那种泄露、暗示的意思。而这个用语是源自于扑克牌游戏，玩家的手没有把这个牌拿好，以至于露出底牌被别人看到了。那引申是用来表达说出某人的意图、计划或是秘密，也就是表明意图、透露意图的意思。举例来说 He hasn't tipped his hand about whether he intends to run for election. 他还没有透露是否打算参选。好，那么以上是今天重点整理，我们回顾今天单字吧。
Storage. At the start of spring, Stephanie puts all of her winter coats in storage. Dusty. The shelves at my uncle's house are filled with dusty old books. Damp. When I woke up, the clothes on the line were still damp. Cord. Can you lift that cord up while I vacuum the floor, please? Outlet. You can plug your phone into the outlet by that chair. Rattle. The coins inside the box rattled when Francis shook it. Thorough. We subject all of our applicants to a thorough interview process.
Well, everyone, today's article has come to an end, and I sure hope you enjoyed reading along with us. I am Roger.
I'm Helen.
See you next time.